type of pruning that we can do right now is to take roses down to a little bit lower height to get through the winter. This is particularly true of hybrid teas and others that tend to be rather top heavy, and it prevents what we call wind rocker, where if we get a really heavy wind blowing up, they'll start to rock in the ground and the roots might become loosened. This is especially so of ones that might have just been planted last spring. So we want to take the height down only by about a third, and this is not their final height. It's just enough to remove some of the top heaviness so that they'll be a little bit stronger against the wind. Now at this time on roses you can also take some of the dead wood off if you want to, if you're in a mood to tidy up your landscape a little bit. But that'd be about it for right now. Now there are some plants that you really don't want to touch at all right now in the fall. It's very tempting to want to go around the yard, especially now that the leaves have dropped, and tidy everything up a bit, but you really need to hold off considerably. And some of those that you want to wait to prune are peaches, as we mentioned just a few minutes ago. Included in that group are the rest of the fruit trees, other stone fruits like cherries and plums, apples and pears. You should also wait until late winter if at all possible, because you never know how cold it might get, and you want to leave as much wood on there as possible to avoid damage to what remains after pruning in late winter. Now, grapevines are another plant that it's tempting to want to get in there and really prune them back right now. And you do want to remove about 90% of the current season's growth, but not right now. Wait again until late February to do that pruning as well. Other things that you don't want to prune right now in the ornamentals group would be crepe myrtle. They're standing tall and they still have their seed pods from having bloomed this summer, but you want to wait until late spring before you prune crepe myrtle because they're very prone to winter injury depending on the type of season that we have. Another group of plants that you want to hold off on are some of the herbaceous perennials, particularly chrysanthemums and asters. And the reason for this is that they're providing a sort of a standing mulch over the plants, and if you prune them now and we get into some warm weather, they may resume growth and then get nipped back by a later freeze later this winter. So don't prune those right now. Now over in the vegetable garden, asparagus is another plant that a lot of people get real antsy about wanting to prune right now. It's standing tall, has a blonde appearance, looks dead for all intents and purposes, but beneath the soil it's very much alive and semi-dormant. If you prune that back right now and we get into a warm spell again, those spears may start coming up prematurely and you could get some early damage. So leave the asparagus standing until probably about the 1st of March, and then you could prune that off. Now there's a group of plants that you want to wait until after they bloom to prune, and those are ones that you could walk around the yard and look at right now. If they're fat with flower buds, such as dogwood, azaleas, and forsythia, you can see the flower buds on there. They're very apparent this time of year. You don't want to prune those because you're going to prune off your flowers for next spring. Included in that would also be pussy willows. Now you may want to take some of those off this spring for forcing, such as forsythia and pussy willows, but for the most part, don't do any severe pruning on them until after they bloom this spring. Then after that, there are those plants that you want to wait until they start their first flush of growth, and that would be around the 1st of May for pruning evergreens. In this group, we're talking about junipers, pines, yews, other needled evergreens. You should wait until they're in a flush of growth, and then you can do what we call candle pinching or trimming on those so that they can continue to grow in the early summer and cover up where you've done the trimming. Don't do it right now, by all means, because it could be very unsightly until spring. Well, I'm going to continue working on this rose bush and getting it down a little bit for wind, and keep in mind that with most roses, you really don't need to prune them until the middle of March, but we just want to get the height down so we don't get this thing upended in a heavy windstorm. Today we're in Oklahoma City to visit with Mark Bays. Mark is Urban Forestry Coordinator with the State Department of Agriculture's Forestry Services. And Mark, I understand Oklahoma City suffered a terrible storm in July.
We really did. Last week in July we had 97-mile-an-hour linear winds come through Oklahoma City. And this neighborhood where we're at in the center part of the city seemed to get quite a lot of the damage.
Well, I can hear that they're doing a bit of work on the trees in the background.
We're still recovering from it. And actually that brings up a great point. point, now is a wonderful time for people to get out into their yards and really take a close look and see what kind of damage they had. The trees have lost their leaves, so you know, some of the problems we're seeing back here on this yard is a lot of the branches have been snapped off and they're still hanging in the tree, and that's something that we probably couldn't, you know, have seen earlier in the year when the tree still had leaves.
Do different trees behave differently in the storm depending on their shape or their species?
Yeah, absolutely. There's probably a couple of different tree species that you know, we saw more damage with, but if you look at the city as a whole, the things that we saw more so than that was the fact that the trees that sustained most of the damage were the ones that didn't have any maintenance on or were improperly pruned. You know, and that's really what we saw more so than just species specific, I think.
Okay, well, this backyard sure has some good examples of that.
Well, good or bad example.
Yeah, depending on how you want to look at it.
To do that.
What happened here?
Well, what happened here is we had this trunk here. This is a mimosa tree, and this side of the tree here actually snapped off. And this is the thing that I'm probably more concerned about. If you look at all the damage around the city, is this is opening up this tree to all sorts of insect problems, disease type problems. And then, so if you have stumps like this, whether they're as big as this one or even small ones like some of the ones that we saw earlier, you probably need to do some corrective pruning on that.
Okay, and you have some examples of what happens to trees that have a natural dieback and what happens internally, things that we don't see normally.
Right, you know, just at first glance you can look at this branch right here and you can see that there's some dead branch right here, but the tree was beginning to seal over that wound, and that's just a natural process that the tree goes through. But if you look on the inside of that, you can see all the internal damage that's happening with that. The same thing's going to happen on people's trees if they don't come back and do some target pruning and remove all those snags that are in the branches and get them back to a branch collar on that tree. And you all have discussed many times, you know, what proper pruning practices are.
Right.
And it's just amazing, you know, like I said, first glance, doesn't appear to be the damage, and you look on the inside there and there's an extensive amount of damage in that tree.
Well, what I found amazing as well is the around the neighborhood here, there are some trees that were completely snapped over and broken off. Others, such as a big elm in the front of this house that looks just fine. A lot of times you think of an elm as being somewhat vulnerable, I guess because we hear so much about Dutch elm disease.
Right.
But it was okay, and so was the soapberry out in front. Now, why was that, do you think?
Well, the homeowner here, actually the one big elm tree that you're talking about, had it pruned 2 weeks prior, and it was one of the only trees that were pruned on the property. It was one of their favorite trees, so they had the arborist come out and work on that one, and that sustained little or no damage. And whereas the trees in the backyard here, they weren't ready to prune those, and that's where all the damage occurred.
Oh, that's unfortunate then.
There was one green ash tree in the front yard that had been improperly pruned earlier. It had been topped or rounded off, and a lot of those sprouts that came up off of that tree, you know, they just faulted, and then they lost a lot of the branches that way.
Well, and that's certainly a testimony to why you should never have a tree top. You have some examples in other areas of this backyard of a mimosa that had been topped.
Right,
And
the mimosa tree that is in the other side of this yard over here, it had been topped probably the same time as the one out front did, and it recovered, you know, and it's a really good visual on what happens. If a tree is able to recover from that topping, it'll send up sprouts right where it's
pretty vigorous.
topped. Yeah, it's real vigorous, but then those are weakly attached, and they strip off, and that's where all the damage or the problems are going to occur.
Okay, well, fortunately, your office with the Department of Agriculture here in the state has fact sheets available on hiring an arborist, and a pretty nice selection here of pieces of information on avoiding tree and utility conflicts, all kinds of things. How can the homeowner get hold of this information? What number can they call?
They can call here in Oklahoma City, area code 405-521-3864. Ask for forestry services, and we just have a multitude of flyers that we'll send out talking about all different kinds of tree care, hiring arborists, maintaining mature trees, all that kind of information available.
And this is one final lesson, that you need to make sure that you replant in your backyard. And last of all, we want to mention that next week on Oklahoma Gardening, we're going to go to the chipping site, one of several chipping sites in Oklahoma City, where they've been handling this material and turning it into at least a usable form so that it can go back on landscapes. And Mark will join you there next week, and hopefully you viewers will be back with us next week and join us again on Oklahoma Gardening.
We hope you enjoyed this video. It's part of our OK Gardening Classics YouTube channel. You can also find more recent videos on our Oklahoma Gardening YouTube channel. And join us on social media for great gardening tips, photos, and discussion.